All righty, good morning, everybody. Hope everyone slept well and used their humidifier, as you were advised by Scott early on. Welcome to the final day of TPI 2025. I'm Bryan Tramont, the managing partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer, and I have the great honor this morning to lead today's fireside chat with Börje Ekholm, let me get the title, President and CEO of Ericsson Group. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're very excited to have you here.
It's good to be here, and welcome to Colorado.
Thank you very much. So you have a place here, I understand, a home. So it's a beautiful state, and we're thrilled to be back. Tell us a little bit about how does one become the CEO of Ericsson, and what excites you the most about getting up in the morning?
To become CEO at Ericsson, you start planning very early, age 8, 9, and you chart the path out. No, not really. I actually thought I had retired. I used to be CEO of another Swedish company before, and then we used to live in the US for many, many years. So we decided to move back, and actually move back to Colorado. So I'm a resident in Vail Valley. So that's why I can say welcome to Colorado. So it's less than 2 hours away from here. So I thought I was living the great life in the mountains. And the mountains really, I love the mountains, and I hope you do as well. And don't suffer from altitude sickness. There is one way to prevent that. It's to drink. Not wine, not booze, but water. And start a few days before you come here. Then you'll actually be fine. Anyhow, so I was living my own life. I was a board member of Ericsson in those days, and we were going through severe troubles. We were falling behind on technology, we were losing market share, and we were ultimately not profitable either. So I was asked to become CEO. It was not an easy decision because I loved my life here. But still decided that technology is too exciting to pass by, and connectivity is too exciting of an opportunity to pass by. So I said, okay, fine, I'll join. So that was it's 9 years ago now. So I've been CEO for a number of years, focused on turning around the company. So when you say what excites me, it is actually that part. I'm a big believer in ubiquitous connectivity. And we can often look back and say, think about the consumer 20 years ago. We were still wearing a digital camera. We were a phone was a luxury product used by very few. Today, the consumer has largely digitalized on a cellular 4G network. Very few people have a camera. Very few people have a photo album. Very few people have a fax machine, if you recall. All of these things have now moved over to become smartphone-centric. I think that was the first step. Next step is to make truly coverage ubiquitous. So we're going to digitalize enterprises. We're going to leverage new technology like AI. If that's going to scale, we need connectivity. So connectivity is front and center. So I like that technology part. What I didn't realize when I took the job is that it's also front and center in geopolitics. But maybe you're going to ask about that as well.
I will indeed. Just to step back, the fax machine reference was funny because my doctor just asked me to fax something, so apparently they still have those fax machines. Inexplicably. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing the company? This is a broader question than something we talked about in advance, but I think it's interesting for context, just as you think about the landscape.
Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, I think we are, as one of, I guess it's an increasing share of Western companies facing our biggest and most important competitor in China. And the Chinese competitor they're very strong. I would say they are hyper competitive. And that, to us, we need to stay at the forefront of technology, matching or leading them. If we don't do that, our reason to exist is very limited. So we need to have that focus on always being first with innovation, driving new thinking, and the way we approach the business.
You obviously have a big presence in the U.S., putting aside your home, but as a company. Tell us about the role of Ericsson in the U.S. marketplace and how that fits into the company's vision.
Yeah, we're a truly global company. We're selling in more than 170 countries, call it 180 or something like that. We have people on the ground in 150 countries. So we're truly global. But I would say our most important market is the US. It's for a number of reasons, it's a large market, but it also has front-runner customers. And if we're going to lead on innovation, we need to work with front-runner customers. It's the only way for us to actually drive innovation. So that's important. Besides that, it's of course we depend also on the Western partners we have. So we work with a large number of tech companies in the US in very close partnerships in different parts of the business to build that Western ecosystem. So for us, the US as a technology hub is also critically important to drive our business, I would say.
And in general, you touched a little bit on the Chinese companies and Huawei and the competitive landscape, but how is the business evolving? You mentioned focusing on the business segment, for example. Just how do you see that playing out over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I would say connectivity. You know, if you think about the world, we often talk about it as data is the new oil. And data doesn't really have a value unless it is connected and you can do something with it. So the connectivity part is actually a critical part of the full digital stack. We often talk about compute, we talk about storage, we talk about data centers, etc. That gets most of the attention, but if you don't have the connectivity layer underneath, it's going to be it's pretty much useless. So the connectivity part in that stack is critical. But I would say, you know, given that we have basically developed technology faster than data traffic has grown over the past 25 years. So and we're actually developing, you know, the capacity of a network goes up faster than Moore's law because we add spectrum and leverage the technology. So the reality is we're growing faster. So we have seen a very flattish market, and we expect that market to continue to be flattish. So I think we're in a bit of a conundrum here, where yes, connectivity is critical, but it's actually a little bit flattish outlook.
Is there reason for hope that what will move it off flat?
I think there are reasons for optimism. You know, the reason why it's flat is actually driven by, you know, think about it, the consumer use cases have driven a lot of the traffic in the radio network. And those use cases today are based on downlink, they're based on video, and relatively limited usage of the capabilities of a network. What we see when the world migrates over to 5G SA, we're actually getting completely new type of use cases. That's when we get low latency, we get much higher uplink, you can prioritize uplink, and we can see that on new applications coming. And here, you know, it's again mentioning China, as we were touching on that. China has built the world-leading 5G standalone network, you know, with probably around 4 million base stations. That's more than 10 times as many as in the US. So to understand the density of their grid, and they are now starting to build new applications, leveraging the capabilities in the network. So think about the drone economy. You know, we can actually have 3D positioning in a 5G network. That is something that's leveraged in that. We start to see it in humanoids, we start to see it in robotics. And think about a factory. There are probably 30 to 40,000 enterprise networks in China. There's probably 2,000 in the US. And that's driving factory automation today. Self-guided vehicles, the simplicity of designing a robot when you put compute centrally on a site or in a data center and almost nothing in the robot. It's almost a mechanical construction. It gets a lot cheaper. So you can deploy many more robots. And we're starting to see that being developed in China today. And that's something I think we need to take seriously in the West to actually drive the investments in the digital infrastructure and the digital stack.
So yesterday, Commissioner Symington touched on this fact that the Chinese have led us on the business applications in particular. How did they get ahead of us? Because this has been much discussed in policy circles, if you have a diagnosis for that.
I mean, you have to think about China is an impressive country in many ways, and they're hyper competitive. But what I think is also they make strategic priorities. And you know, if you take telecom as one example, they made a priority, we're back into the 90s now, of saying telecom is a critical horizontal layer in the economy. And we need to make sure that we have a domestic vendor base. So what they did, they spurred innovation. So you had probably, I don't know how many, but I would say, call it 50 startups in telco. And they started to fiercely compete among each other and consolidate up until there were 2 left. And when they had gone through that journey, of course, the best survive.
Yeah.
Right? So they drive, when you think about industrial policy, one needs to recognize China has an enormous scale domestically. And when we talk about technology, it's of course you have to lead on technology, but you also have to be first to scale. So China drives that first to scale very, very forcefully. And that you can see in other industry sectors as well, being batteries, being solar panels, of course in telco, you see it in devices on telcos.
For sure.
You see it across the board. They're actually leveraging that scale. And when you start to get that scale, you build the local ecosystem that becomes very competitive. And you drive innovation in the local ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about Huawei as our main competitor, it's part of a much bigger ecosystem that actually support them.
So, continuing on the China theme for just a moment, it's obviously one of the rare things where it unites Washington, Democrats and Republicans, Biden acolytes and Trump acolytes. Particularly the strategic threat posed by ZTE and Huawei. What is it like to compete with them? And is the playing field level, or what does that look like?
You know, one can always complain about the world, right? But that doesn't rarely help you. So you need to focus on what we can do. So what we do, we work on, let's make sure we have the technology, let's make sure we make enough investments in technology to be able to compete. So take for example, I mean, there have been a big debate in years back about Open RAN, for example. We're all in on Open RAN for the simple reason that that's our way to leverage innovation in the Western ecosystem. If we can leverage that innovation, then we have a bigger ability to compete with Huawei. So we need to always focus on what we can impact and less on the complaining part.
It's probably good advice for us in life in general. So policymakers have pursued a number of initiatives designed to thwart the role of Huawei and ZTE in Western networks. That's included banning their equipment in the US, rip and replace. Those are very linear. And then we have things where we are concerned about our competitiveness internationally and do things like the spectrum pipeline, for example. There is obviously strong interest, and you've touched on this, in trying to develop globally harmonized spectrum bands so that our market share can compete more effectively against the scale of the Chinese and their, at least commercial allies. How important is Western leadership on these issues? We've heard a lot about WRC being in China and what that means or doesn't mean and the implications of that, but just maybe broadly talk about policy approaches and the importance of Western leadership here.
I think it's critically important. We have to start in I think, why it is important. Well, first of all, why is licensed spectrum important? We rarely talk enough about that, but if you need to ensure security, reliability, availability of a network, you really need licensed spectrum. It's very hard to do in unlicensed because you simply don't know what devices are going to come into into the equation, so to say. So licensed spectrum is critically important. And here, having and securing a spectrum pipeline is very important for a country. And again, if you think about the use cases, disregard the consumer for a moment and say, let's say we can solve the consumer issue, that's the best effort requirement. But if you're going to have a humanoid or a robot or a self-driving vehicle that's going to be relying on connectivity, it has to be truly reliable. You can't allow milliseconds of interruptions. And therefore, the next generation of automation in the economy, whether it is using AI or it's using other means of automation, it's going to require reliable connectivity, and that requires spectrum. And having that spectrum pipeline is thus a competitiveness of a country. And that's why I think it's important for Western countries to be deeply... I know the discussions about the WRT in Shanghai, right, and the sensitivities of that, and I can understand that. But I will go all in, much rather, and make sure there is a Western strong representation. Actually, I do believe the US have historically been a leader of spectrum. Think about 4G, for example. It was very well managed in the US and actually put probably the US at the leading edge here on platform companies because they could develop on top of that 4G network. So repeating that in 6G, I think, will be important.
And, well, okay, let's pivot. We're going to do some other Western, let's talk about our Western allies and the Western ecosystem, if we can talk that way. Lots of talk in Washington about trade and tariffs. And how are you looking at the tariff issue? And how should we be thinking about it from a telecom and tech policy perspective?
Yeah, you know, this is a truly fluid situation, very much uncertain. What we do, we actually, the geopolitics is nothing new. This came a few years ago. It was pretty clear. So we decided to build a factory in the US. So we have manufacturing operation in the US. We built that, started it up 2020. So we feel that we have a fairly flexible supply chain, trying to manage whatever the tariffs are ultimately going to be. But I think that's I often say, you know, the world falls down in two buckets. One you can impact and one you can't impact. And don't focus too much on the one you can't impact. And this one will have its own course.
Fair enough. The same lesson, as my mother always taught me, control the things you can. What is the current state, and this is informed by the tariff question and also obviously by the Chinese rivalry issue, of the EU-US partnership, obviously in the news the last few days at a geopolitical military perspective on Ukraine, but how do you just generally view the state of the economic partnership?
Yeah, that's about the minefield, I guess. Maybe we shouldn't make that reference given Ukraine, but it's, of course, it's a difficult situation, right? But I would like to start in the point of saying the transatlantic relationship have been very strong for 80 years. And saying now that we should throw it overboard, I think seems very premature and very simplistic on both sides. I think both actually needs each other. Again, if we are thinking about the global competition, we need to rally the Western ecosystem. That means we need to work together, the US, Europe, like-minded countries. I add India, I add Japan in there, for example. Right, so we all need to actually start to work together. That's the best way for us to be competitive. Even the US, how large it is not large enough to be on its own. So I think finding that path, I think will happen, and that's what we really need to work for. I also think the relationship with Europe is a bit more complex for maybe a different reason, and we don't talk as much about it. But I think the real problem is the underperformance of Europe over the past 20 years. And Europe has dramatically underperformed the US in the last 20 years. You know, go back 15, 20 years, Europe and the US had the same size of the economy. Today, Europe is a third less, third smaller almost. Productivity development have been much stronger in the US than in Europe. Probably a productivity difference of 20%. American companies invest 50 to 100% more in R&D and CapEx compared to European companies. So Europe is falling behind in that partnership. Basically, I don't think it's and I tell my European peers, I don't think it's fair, maybe the wrong word, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect the US always to carry all the burdens in those partnerships. So Europe needs to fix some of its own problems as well, which means focus on innovation, focus on R&D, focus on how do you actually build a competitive economy. If you do that, then you have a stronger partnership because you have kind of stronger partners together. So you see it now, Europe is now making investments in defense, long overdue, very long overdue. So I do think there is some fertile ground for change, but I'm on the record of saying Europe is becoming a museum. And it's becoming an open-air museum, still using paper tickets because connectivity is so bad. But this is where I think Europe needs to get its act together. That's why I think the simplistic European is blame the Americans. I think that's too easy.
Interesting. If you'll indulge me, you touched on India. Do you mind just spending a moment on how India fits into this conversation?
Yeah. India is a critically important market for us. So we made a strategic choice, we're back now 7-8 years ago, to say that we need to win in the US because it's a front runner market and it's big. We need to win in India because it's simply big. Now it's proving to be a front runner market as well. The data consumption per subscriber is by far the highest in India today, in the world, and growing faster. The way they have digitalized society around the 4G network is second to none today. So you have a digital identity for all, etc. Payments are done today on the digital platform. So India is really important. So for us, we have invested quite a lot in, we think you have to become kind of local in the markets you're at, which is why we built the manufacturing here. We have R&D in the US, etc. Do the same in India, and we're trying to do the same in Japan because it's such an important part as well.
Thank you for that. So at TPI, we generally have to have an AI question, or else you can't actually have a panel. So what are you all doing on AI in terms of incorporating into the network and how AI is a driver for all your verticals?
No, it's AI, I think, is maybe the most fundamental technology we have seen so far. Maybe the most for us as a company and for us as a society, no doubt. Then you can debate if it's a hype or not. Doesn't really matter. Everyone said that the internet was a hype in 2000. 25 years later, I wouldn't say it is. I would say the impact is much bigger. But what I do think is we overestimate the impact in 1 year horizon, but we underestimate the impact in a 10-year horizon. So think about that on AI as well. The impact is starting to be seen now. We see it the way we operate networks. So they are today, we incorporated into how we operate the network, basically, how we develop products. So we see already now efficiency gains, for example, on spectrum efficiency. In some of the most optimized algorithms in a radio network, we can still do better with AI to get 10% more spectrum efficiency. It's quite a lot.
Meaningful,
actually.
yeah.
It's very meaningful.
Yeah.
Then, of course, we run it in our internal operations, etc. It will change fundamentally how we operate the company. We're starting to see some cost efficiencies coming out. I'm convinced there will be job losses in certain job categories, but there will be new job categories created that probably will grow faster, that we're also starting to see.
Is government hindering or helping on AI, or is it not a factor at this stage of its development, at least for the company?
It is a factor. I would, to put it bluntly, I think the US government gets this, actually having relatively loose regulation on AI compared to Europe. The AI Act in Europe is today a hindrance. And I'm a big believer that regulation is needed in some shape and form, but when you regulate something before it has happened, you have to regulate so many of the possible outcomes that you'll put a wet blanket on innovation. And that's what is happening now on AI in Europe. And certain open source models are not available in Europe today. So if you want a leading open source model, hard to get. And I understand that because the risk of the unclarity in the regulatory regime is so big that it creates uncertainty. So I would say if Europe is to have a position in AI, reviewing regulation is the first step.
Yes, well, the museum theme continues. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a second. Drew, we'll be ready for you in a second here. You alluded earlier about 6G, and we talked a little bit about 5G and the questions around, one of the big issues for the carriers is monetizing 5G, right? Yeah. How successful it hasn't been. As we look at 6G, both in terms of leadership, important, and then also how it looks from the carrier's perspective to be able to successfully monetize that. How do you think about those things?
You can argue, if you look at one of the large operators in the US, they have actually monetized 5G as well. But otherwise, if you ask most customers, they will say they struggle to monetize 5G. And the reason for that is most operators around the world have really built out 5G non-standalone, which to me is actually a capacity addition to the 4G network. So it gives you more capacity, but doesn't really give you the capabilities of the 5G network. So think, what is it actually we said in 5G that's meaningful? It's low latency, it's better uplink, it's actually network slicing. These things you can only do if you have a 5G SA network. To be honest, around the world, there is one in the US of scale. The others have as well, but it's one of scale. You have one in India, you have in Singapore, you have a couple around the world outside of China, but it's very few. So of course, it's very hard to monetize something you don't have. So the network has to be built on 5G SA. That's why that has to happen. When that happens, then we need new monetization models. And that's why we invest quite a lot. And we should have done this earlier. I recognize we're part of the blame here, so it's not trying to excuse that. But we need to also make those capabilities of the 5G SA network available. So whether it is low latency on demand, so we actually can allow the developers to say, okay, I'm going to need low latency for this application, where I have real time, could be wearables like goggles, right? I need certain performance, and I can get that instantaneously. And that's, traditionally an API, and that's what we are trying to do now, to build that ecosystem. But that's going to be critically important for the monetization to happen. So if we think about 6G, these are the capabilities that needs to be monetized in 6G as well. So we need to create that monetization platform.
And just US versus maybe I should say it differently, Western countries versus, or even free world versus China, maybe that's the best way to talk about it.
Yeah. China, you're seeing it on network slices.
Yeah.
It's happening, right? It's happening on enterprise networks, virtual enterprise networks, etc. So there you're starting to see that ecosystem being built. I would single out the US is a front runner here, but here we're starting to see applications happening. So, for example, you can sell network slice for mission critical applications. That's actually started to be monetized here. You see at stadiums you can buy guaranteed uplink on the network slice. So you're starting to see these things coming through, but it's really only in the front runner markets.
Got it. Thank you. All right, Mr. Clark, we have to get you a mic real quick.
Thank you for being here. Well, here we go. Quick. No, it's great to have someone with your perspective here. So I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and kind of two parts of the question are Ericsson in the global telecommunications equipment market. Now, you've obviously talked a lot about Huawei versus Ericsson, but could you broaden the conversation a bit, include, for example, Nokia, Samsung, maybe there's others that you would kind of put in this large telecommunications capabilities. So what do you all have in common? What do you differ on? And that's the first part. The second part is none of these companies are headquartered in the United States, and given you're singing the praises of the US and productivity, why do we not have, you know, one of these companies or another like it headquartered in the United States?
Yeah, if we start in the end of talking about competitors, you know, I rarely do that for the simple reason that I focus on Ericsson. I let them talk on their part. But I will say that the whole Western ecosystem actually depends on having a number of Western vendors as well. But I'm not sure the Western ecosystem is large enough to support 3. That you need to think about. So you know, the Chinese ecosystem has 2, right? And that's 60% of the global market for radio. So when you think about this as a scale business, you need to think about how many can actually the market carry. And that to me is an unanswerable question right now. But I'm not certain. So that's why I don't talk too much about competition, more than saying we need, of course, competition is what drives innovation, so you need that, no doubt. And that's why we compete with the Chinese, we compete with the other Western vendors. But we need to think about the total ecosystem in the West, and we don't talk about that as much. That's one thing. The other one, you know, to think about, I don't know why the US doesn't have a domestic telecom company in that sense. Used to have a couple, but you know, you can either say, if you take the cynical argument, it's a less attractive part of the tech stack, so it was better to have somebody else do it from a US perspective. That's the cynical argument. You know, I don't like that answer, but that could be, well, the argument. But the other one is to say we need to work in a constellation across countries. I don't think having a talk about digital sovereignty only as domestic vendors may not be the best way to think about the world. We need to think about how do we create that Western world that actually hangs together. Because if everyone's going to talk about building their own domestic champion, you're simply not going to have the scale to compete. And if you look back at the US, you know, tried many different paths. Think about CDMA. That was the backbone of some of the European or American leaders in telecom. Then never got the global scale. So that became very hard to compete on a global basis. And in a scale business, scale is what matters. So the answer, I think, is relatively complex on that.
Okay, we now have 5 more questions. I think I might have time for 2, and Laura snatched the microphone deftly, I thought, right there. You're up, Laura.
Generative AI feels to be pushing hyperscalers, which are US media platforms and telcos, closer together. So I'm interested in what role strategically you think Ericsson sees for itself in this emerging ecosystem where latency becomes mission critical. Do you think you're just a pure infrastructure play, or do you think you can move higher up the tech stack in value?
I think it's a great question, because this is actually why I'm relatively optimistic about, we've had a flattish development for many, or for 2 decades at least on the market. But I think the demands of AI, Gen AI, will actually drive a lot more traffic and will demand new type of capabilities. I don't see that we will move up the stack, but I see that the criticality of the connectivity layer will be even more important. And ubiquitous coverage will be a very important part. And I think that's our key part to invest in.
All right, one more. Okay, Preston, you want to pick us up? And then we'll close it out and head over to Bede.
Thank you. EchoStar is building a 5G standalone network, hoping to be the 4th facilities-based wireless network in America. And I'm just curious how you handicap their odds of succeeding.
Yeah, the US is a very consolidated market, I think we need to say. But I also think, it's actually hard for me to comment on, to be honest. But the most big markets have 3 to 4 operators. The US have 3 very big, and EchoStar. And I think what they need to do is to be disruptive. And figure out a way to be disruptive. And it's not necessarily disruptive on just how you build a network. It's actually on your offerings. What do you target? What do you sell to? And then I think there is an opportunity. This market can clearly be large enough.
All right, with that, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate a round of applause for Börje. And then I'm going to welcome up Scott on our next panel on Bede.